Today we'll be discussing William Hogarth. Before we get into his works, we'll touch rapidly on the urbanization happening in France and England in the 18th century, a topic to which we will return this semester. This was a monumental demographic shift. People began crowding together in urban areas rather than and shifting away from agricultural labor. We also saw the rising middle class, and this led to the proliferation of visual culture and the potential for art to address a public because of denser populations and more money to spend on purchasing things like prints and going to see art. It's also important to put Hogarth in the context of England's cultural hegemony at this moment. In other words, the real sort of power England held as a cultural force in the 18th century. And this power grew out of the middle class stabilization and its industrial and commercial strides that happened during the 18th century. This would happen a little bit later in the rest of Europe, a few decades later in France, etc. So at this moment, English trade dominated the mercantile nations, and again, the middle class expanded. So England and everything English came into vogue, including treatises on economics, philosophy, new literary forms. This was in contrast to the Flemish influence that had been so prominent in the 17th century that we saw with the English court bringing in Rubens and Van Dyck. So Flanders, the Netherlands, they were the sort of cultural powerhouse in the 17th century. That's why the English kings brought their artists in to work for them. But England and Englishness rose in the 18th century because of these economic factors. The English novel, both sentimental novels and satirical novels, also became enormously influential at this moment. And at the center of a move, a really novel move towards a kind of public-facing art is William Hogarth, who also participated in the tradition of the kind of satire that was also rising with authors like Swift and Fielding. So Hogarth lived from 1687 to 1764, a very long time, through three monarchs. And he's credited for being the father of a kind of English school focused on native traditions. He was a Londoner by birth, an urbanite through and through. And he helps us understand the views and tastes of a broad section of society, since he aimed his work not only at the aristocracy, right, not only to please the tastes and propaganda interests of a king, but he was aiming for his art to reach and please the well-to-do middle class and general public. Hogarth, in fact, waged a campaign against the aristocratic taste for the continental, especially Flemish and Italian art. I'm reminding you again of the important role of Peter Paul Rubens and Anthony Van Dyck on official English art of the 17th century. So because Hogarth was looking to create and to emphasize a decidedly English tradition, he didn't look to visual arts precedents, which were more European in nature, but to literature to create something uniquely English. So this kind of push for an English art tradition, almost to the point of nativism, is evidenced even in this pug in Hogarth's self-portrait, which we saw in your introductory lecture. A pug is a breed that is very English in sort of connotation. And let's look at that little pug. Remember, his name is Trump. His, and by his I mean the dog's, is the more tangible body in the self-portrait, closer to the picture plane and standing in for the painter in a way, because the artist's image is removed and placed in an oval canvas within the canvas. Both portraits, man and dog, which are set into a pretty close relationship, are unpretentious, right? Not beautiful, especially that little pug's face with the little tongue stretched out, right? This isn't a beautiful dog. Hogarth refuses to idealize his pet and instead emphasizes a fidelity to the observed world and all of its flaws. Remember that commitment to sort of unfettered realism that Hogarth represents in that serpentine line scratched into the painter's palette in the bottom left of the self-portrait. He also rests his own image on a stack of books. He's showing his reliance on authors like Jonathan Swift and William Shakespeare to create an English cultural tradition, and also, as we'll see, because he would design a series of narrative paintings and prints that follow a single character through a sequence of social events, much like chapters in a book or scenes from a play. So we'll see this narrative approach to painting that's quite unique in the visual arts and draws much more from the literary tradition. Hogarth, as we'll see, innovated a new form of history painting, which parodies the very serious French tradition. In France, artists like Nicolas Poussin were famous for creating history paintings, and by that I mean big canvases with multi-figure stories from the Bible, from ancient mythology, from history, that were supposed to sort of show grand, important moral lessons to a broad audience. So while Hogarth still included moralizing content in his comic history paintings, they have a sense of humor. He considered himself to be a comic history painter, claiming a new genre of painting that was explicitly British, right? Differentiating from the French tradition, from the Italian or Flemish traditions, and relying on humor as a part of that native identity. So he styles himself as a painter of a new kind of British art, not only for ideological reasons, but it also helped Hogarth's financial self-interest. His father had tried his hand at commercial enterprise, but was far less successful. His father was a schoolmaster and a kind of sometime entrepreneur who published textbooks and tried to open a coffee house for intellectuals, which ended up failing, and his father was thrown into debtor's prison. So money is often a part of the story of art history. Hogarth wanted to make money, right? He wanted to be financially successful. He didn't come from an aristocratic background. And so he appealed to a wider audience than just coffee shop intellectuals or academics in art or connoisseurs, the cultural establishment, by introducing caricature and satire, humor in other words, into history painting. So we're going to see these comic history paintings where he's going to mock marriage and the church, prison, and the poorhouse. He trained as an engraver. Hogarth also tried to expand the audience for his art by translating his paintings and prints into prints. So things that could circulate and be bought by the middle class. So Hogarth became an innovator at painting in a narrative series. Here I'm showing you two images from his election series. This is a 4-part series, so this is just one of 4 scenes from 1754. And he wasn't interested in individuals, but in representing types or typological characters. These images are meant to be very tongue-in-cheek. You can see, and this might be a little clearer on the image at left, in the doorway of this tavern where politicians are canvassing for votes, you see a lion eating a fleur-de-lis, the symbol for France. Hogarth was very Francophobic. There's a lot of jokes against the French here. And this is a tavern. This is not a scene of the aristocracy. This is not an important historical or mythological moment, but a scene from middle-class life. A lot of the humor in this work and Hogarth's other works comes from the improper use of wigs. Always pay attention to wigs in Hogarth's works. And this is a symbol of status gone awry, of people sort of pretending to be fancier than they are, in other words. So if you look at the very right-hand side of the painting, you can see a man with a wig on backwards. You have wigs askew. This is really making fun of people's pretensions. You have a banner hanging outside this tavern showing a man throwing coins to a crowd. So this is an image mocking politicians who seem to be buying the favor of their potential voters. So this is an image of corruption in politics, right? At a moment where political enfranchisement was being expanded to the British middle class. The image at right, you can see, is an opposite. You can see it's composed in the opposite way. This is an engraving of Hogarth's painting. And Hogarth, at this point in his career, he figured out the trick to create paintings really in order to sell these engravings or penny prints. The mid-18th century saw the first venues for selling prints, and these became kind of the first art galleries, right, before museums emerged in England in the 1760s. And again, this coincides with the rise of the middle or merchant class in England that Hogarth is both mocking and also selling his prints to. So why is he doing both? Why is he painting and selling these etchings? Well, by doing the paintings in the first place, he's increasing the value of his prints because of this strict and traditional hierarchy of media. He needs to be seen as a legitimate, as an important artist in order for his prints to sell. Also, by selling his prints, right, he not only makes money, but he gains more of a following, which ensures his paintings' inclusion in the major exhibitions of his day. This process of printmaking, etching and engraving on paper, was fairly new. It's incredibly detailed, and it meant that artwork could be distributed more widely. The arts were able, in this way, to find a new market, and art became more public, right? You didn't have to visit an important chapel to see artwork or gain entrance to a palace in order to see art, but you actually could see it in these print shops. You could go and view it in the windows, but you could also buy it, perhaps, if you had a little bit of extra money. So Hogarth makes a living off of the prints, and even after his death, his wife supports herself by reprinting some of his more famous works. So who is he printing for? Who is he selling these to? Well, the lower middle classes. Hogarth, in fact, creates an art market in this group. And more artists will come up the ladder with this new possibility, with this new way into the art world. Hogarth had a couple of very famous series. One was Marriage a la Mode, which we'll see in a moment. And this is a print from the series A Rake's Progress. These were his modern moral subjects series. They were also called Novels and Paint. And he chose subjects related to popular plays and novels of his moment. Like plays or novels, the series have fully worked out plots, dramatic confrontations, changes of scenes, serious and tragic elements juxtaposed, and were very topical to contemporary life and some of the issues facing folks in the mid-18th century. Now, A Rake's Progress consists of 8 scenes, and it exemplifies the moral mentality of the age. The main character in the series is Tom Rakewell, and a rake is a sort of ne'er-do-well man, a man who sort of gets around, makes bad choices. Again, if you've seen the series Bridgerton, you're familiar with the sort of name calling of rake. So Thomas Rakewell, who we see here in the lower left-hand corner with his legs splayed up on this table, he is a gentleman who comes into a modest inheritance. He typifies the middle-class tendency to emulate the tastes and fashions of the aristocracy, of the wealthy landed upper crust, and ultimately falls into incarceration and a really tragic ending. The rake ends up marrying an older woman for her fortune. He then gambles that fortune away. He gets locked up in a debtor's prison. Remember Hogarth's father's story. And he suffers in the end from syphilitic madness and fantasy. Themes of social climbing and the decadence and evils of social institution pervade this series and Hogarth's other series. And this scene, which we saw briefly in our introductory meeting, is an orgy scene in a tavern, Rose Tavern on Drury Lane in London. And the key tension in the scene is social change, social mobility. Hogarth is posing the question through the scene, through the series, about whether money gives you social standing, right? Can you live a lifestyle offered by money, but without taste? So we have a kind of interplay between a servant class and a master class. Hogarth includes a caricatured woman of African descent in the back left behind the rake. So we have a sort of hierarchy of people in service here. There's a prostitute, several prostitutes in the scene, but one in the lower right-hand corner is about to leave. She's pulling up her torn stockings. She also has, and this is a little bit harder to see in the prints, but you're really meant to be able to pick it out if you were an 18th century viewer. She has a kind of black spot on her forehead, which is a syphilitic sore. So syphilis was a, problematic disease in the 18th century. They didn't know how to cure it. Of course, it was sexually transmitted. So this alludes to her status as a prostitute in addition to her bared breast, and is a theme in Hogarth's work showing you sort of sexual promiscuity. The scene is coarsened up for the print, so you see more of these syphilitic sores, you see more of these tears in the stockings in the print, right, geared towards the lower classes than you do in Hogarth's paintings. The prints are meant to serve as kind of lower class entertainments, not quite like watching a television show, but almost, right? He packs the scenes with detail, so you're really getting your money's worth if you buy this print. There's a lot of, you're rewarded the more time you spend with this, with little humorous passages and little Easter eggs hidden throughout. The other key tension in this orgy scene, right? This is a young man behaving badly in a tavern, right? People drinking, people gambling, eating too much. But this is supposed to act as a kind of microcosm of bad behavior, which signals a broader undermining of the world order of the English Empire. So I mentioned last time that under the ceiling, you have lined this series of portraits of Roman emperors. So this is referencing a topic that Brits were obsessed with at this moment, which was Roman decadence before the fall of the Roman Empire. In the same period, Montesquieu published a book called The Considerations on the Causes of the Grandeur of the Romans and Their Decadence, published this in 1734, which also foreshadowed Gibbon, who published The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in 1776. So almost everything in this room is broken, is damaged. Even in the background, we have a woman standing above the crowd, setting fire to a map of the world. So destroying the world order in a fairly literal way here. And this emerges, these fears, these anxieties, emerges at a time when social and political changes, right, these big demographic changes, these big economic changes, led to fears that projected this sort of decadence and decline of European culture, of British society. So Hogarth is giving this kind of moral lesson here, right? He doesn't approve of this rake's behavior. He's showing how it could lead to more serious social ills, right? Individual choices leading to sort of bigger social problems. But he wants people to buy this print, so it can't be this sort of serious moralizing thing. He's mixing this this sort of dual strategy of appeal and disdain, pleasure and disgust. So you have a prostitute in the back of the table spitting right across the table at another woman. You have people drinking, but you also have, right, exposed breasts and legs, the sort of pleasure of the twinkle of a candle against a metal plate in the background. There's also a chamber pot spilling over a meal, that candle and tray in the right middle ground, the right side of the print, was used in a kind of filthy kind of body dance. There's a bottle of pills that are spilled, which suggests that the rake, Miss Tom Rakewell, already suffers from syphilis, which will get worse as the series goes on. He wears a sword at his side in this kind of dynamic diagonal, but it's sort of cast off. It's not being worn properly here. Now, swords were reserved for gentlemen, for members of the nobility, but by showing the sword sort of hanging off him in this way, and his coat unbuttoned and his breeches all askew, it shows that he's abandoning his role as a gentleman here. So chaos is the subject matter of art making here, and this is something called a social satire. This is meant to be entertaining, aimed at middle-class customers, but it also has this moral message, even as it titillates and entertains. It demonstrates this anxiety about the growing influence of a senseless middle class on British culture. Hogarth, even though he comes from the middle classes, he worries about the middle class role in determining the tastes of the moment. I'll return to this print from a Rake's Progress, just to briefly mention an interesting copyright issue. After prints of his series A Harlot's Progress, which we'll see at the end of our meeting, were pirated and printed by others, and Hogarth lost money, right, on the sort of unethical consumption of his works. Before he published A Rake's Progress, he pushed an act through Parliament that would provide copyright protection for engravers, for prints. So although the paintings for A Rake's Progress were finished in 1734, he didn't publish his prints until that law went through in 1735. This is the first scene from Hogarth's most famous series, Marriage à la Mode. This is a 6-scene series, so there are 6 images from Marriage à la Mode, and this series is interested in the ambiguity of social status, the degeneracy of the aristocracy, and the evils of the institution of contracted marriage. So scene 1, which you're looking at, shows a merchant who is selling his daughter off to a lord, a member of the aristocracy, in exchange for a title. So this is a member of the middle class, the rising and wealthy middle class, marrying into an aristocratic family. Now, why would the aristocratic family do this? Well, there are signals here that they have lost their wealth. So they have the titles, the name, but if you look out the window, beyond the aristocratic father, who on the right side of this painting, so the window above him, you can see a grand house, a kind of grand British estate that's fallen into dilapidation and disrepair. We know that that's the aristocratic father down below this window because he's pointing to his impressive family tree, right? His very impressive lineage. And so the Lord is agreeing for his son to marry a woman of middle-class origin in order to pay off his debts and continue with the art patronage that is evidenced by the massive amount of paintings up on the walls. The aristocratic father here underneath that window at right is shown to be suffering from both gout and venereal disease, which you see his foot is wrapped in gauze and placed on a little footstool. Gout is very painful. You can see a crutch next to his chair. And gout was associated by Hogarth and others at this moment with the aristocracy because gout is often caused from eating really fatty foods and drinking alcohol. So that's something only wealthy people could afford. So you can see that the middle class father, the father of the bride, has pushed a pile of money towards the aristocratic father, and the middle class father, who's sitting on the left hand side of the table in that bright red coat, is shown to be wearing a wig that looks really silly on him. So he has these kind of pretensions that he's not pulling off. Again, wigs are often the source of a lot of humor. There's also an attack on the institution of marriage, symbolized by the unhappy dogs chained together in the left foreground, which I'm showing you in a detail at left here. This is an old trope, an old joke, going back to a very famous example from the Italian Renaissance. This is Veronese's The Wedding Feast at Cana, a massive painting that lives in the Louvre, actually just across the room from the Mona Lisa. You can see two little greyhounds in the wedding feast at Cana tied very unhappily together. One is looking away, one is sort of laying down resigned. This bodes very poorly. This is a joke about a wedding tethering together two unwilling and unhappy figures that Hogarth repeats in his painting. Again, a little Easter egg for knowledgeable viewers to laugh at. So Hogarth mirrors those unhappy little dogs in the left foreground by depicting the future groom and bride who you see on the left-hand side of the painting. The young man is uninterested in the beautiful young bride next to him, and she, looking, unhappy and dejected, is being whispered to by the family lawyer, which will he will become attached to her later in the series. So it's sort of foreshadowing this unhappy marriage, both in the dogs and in the placement of the figures at left. Hogarth compulsively fills his paintings with detail and incident, including small jokes, to give the audience their money's worth. But each motif fits into the larger narrative of the series and really pushes the story along. So he's ridiculing marriage. He's ridiculing both the middle class and the aristocracy here. He's also ridiculing the father of the groom's mania for art collecting. So throughout the room, there's a clutter of sort of meaningless bric-a-brac. He's mocking the man's pretensions to be an expert of art and culture. He's also, and this is again kind of hard to see, this is something that you wouldn't notice unless you spent a lot of time with the painting or the print, but most of the paintings on the wall depict themes of cruelty and martyrdom, again foreshadowing the theme of the series, foreshadowing the destiny of this marriage. So that's another dynamic of critique and a little nugget for viewers in the know. This is scene 4 from the same series, Marriage a la Mode. The marriage has happened, and this depicts the Countess, who has the the yellow and pink dress in the right half of the painting. She's getting her hair done here. So this is a kind of married lady's fantasy. She's being tended to by hairdressers, fashionable ladies, singers, servants, a bunch of sort of sycophants. After the death of the old earl, the wife, so one of the fathers in the last scene, the wife is now a countess. There's a coronet, a kind of crown above her bed that you see on the left-hand side of the painting. She's also become a mother. A child's teething coral hangs from her chair. So we know she's become a mother, although she's not with her child now. The lawyer that we saw in the last scene, his name is Silvertongue, the man who wrote up the marriage contract, is inviting her to a masquerade, which he's pointing to a scene of a masquerade on the screen behind him. That's how you sort of get in this future tense, right, in a scene like this. So that's a pretty inappropriate invitation. A group of visitors at left listen to an opera singer, possibly a eunuch, a castrato, who's accompanied by a flautist. In the right foreground, a small page of African descent, wearing a plumed turban. This signals some of England's darker, more problematic colonial histories. He wears a plumed turban and points to, this may look strange, a little figurine with a human body and a kind of deer's head, a horned animal's head. And this is meant to be a really mean joke, a reference to the fact that the young Viscount, who is not pictured here, is being cuckolded by the lawyer. So the lawyer is sleeping with the bride here, and that's what those horns refer to. So Hogarth is breaching decorum, right? He's making some pretty racy suggestions here, and also, again, making jokes through the art on the walls. There's an image of above the bride's head of Jupiter and Io, of Jupiter appearing as smoke and making love to a woman. This is an image of a very intense image of Renaissance eroticism, and it's placed on the wall next to a group of Catholic saints. And there's also a Roman bust in the room and Chinese porcelain objects. So this is showing not just an eclectic art taste, but sort of inappropriate groupings. Not bad taste in the selection of objects, but in their placement. So kind of uneducated art collecting. So scene 5, things are ending badly. This shows the reunited Count and Countess, with the Count who is dying at right. He's been stabbed, right? You can see the sword stabbed into the floor, blood on his shirt. The lawyer, Silver Tongue, who is undressed, is fleeing out the window, clearly the murderer here. The plate that follows this, the final plate, shows the Countess also dying, flanked by her baby who has inherited her father's syphilis, very tragic, and her own father, who removes the ring from her finger before she dies. So one last act of greed. The content is certainly anti-aristocratic, but Hogarth is also marketing his paintings to an aristocratic audience, while the engravings are destined for the middle class. So he's making fun of both sectors of society in order to appeal to both, to sell to both. And if Hogarth's sordid pictorial chronicles show a really tough critique of society, he also uses art to depict the values which he believed to be good. He points out the flaws of society and profits from his didacticism. Hogarth's moralizing strategies are included in the wealth of details in this other series, A Harlot's Progress. You're seeing scene 1 of this here. There is a horse at left toppling over a huge pile of pots and pans. This foreshadows the impending catastrophe and danger to the young and beautiful woman in the foreground. A danger specifically to her virginity, this a sort of broken ceramics, broken pots and pans, that is a sort of moral device alluding to virginity as something that cannot be repaired. She is coming to town. This is a country girl come to London. She's brought a goose to visit her cousin, but she's been intercepted as she gets to town. She is easy prey in the big city. A bawd, B-A-W-D, in other words, a kind of madam, approaches her, right, is clutching her face, noting how beautiful and young she is, how much money she could potentially make off this young woman. And we know that she is a madam or a bawd because of those blackened syphilitic sores on her face. Again, syphilis is big with Hogarth. So the scene is foreshadowing. It's showing a young woman getting ensnared by a kind of predator in the big city. And a lot of the tension in the scene comes from this contrast between the youth and age of these two women in the foreground. So we're skipping forward to scene 5 of A Harlot's Progress. The woman has been, the young woman from the country visiting her cousin, has become a prostitute. She is now dying from venereal disease. We see pills scattered on the floor once again. She's had a child who's kneeling next to her, who is very sadly cooking his own meat over the fire, a display of real neglect, right? She's just had the harlot, as she's become, has just had her teeth pulled. There's a woman in the left foreground sorting her clothes in anticipation of her death. A pot is spilling over on the fire and catching fire. So this is a real sort of desperate scene here. And we can see why this scene would appeal to both the parson, or sort of religious people, and the hedonist. It's showing a moral lesson, the kind of terrible destiny for the gullible or depraved. It's a tragedy and a comedy, right? There's pleasure, there's titillation in Hogarth's moralizing scenes, in the exposed breasts, in the beautiful faces, in the inclusion of turbans and sometimes animals. So Hogarth is mixing both in order to deliver his message through humor. And Hogarth was relentlessly topical, right? He's covering some of the greatest, social concerns of his day. So it'd be interesting to think about what he would tackle if he was working today. What sort of scenes could you imagine him creating? So far we've seen Hogarth's comic history paintings. These are social satires, right, presented in narrative sequence. But Hogarth also drew a few political cartoons in the service, in this case, of political intervention, sort of political messaging. There were laws passed in the early 18th century encouraging the consumption of cheap gin by making licensing easy and putting a very low tax on liquor, on alcoholic beverages. Parliament made these laws and kept these laws because many members of Parliament owned large amounts of land and grew corn, which liquor was distilled from. There were disastrous health effects on the social and physical health of the poor because of this very cheap and easily available gin. Death rates increased and crime increased in the 1730s and 40s, in part because of gin. Hogarth and Fielding, the author, were among those who demanded legal reform. And in 1751, Hogarth published the twin prints Gin Lane, and Beer Street, to make his point and to try to advocate for the increased taxation of gin and the cheaper taxation of beer, which he thought was a healthier choice. So like A Rake's Progress and Marriage a la Mode, Hogarth uses a detail-packed scene to point out an obvious moral lesson. Gin leads to poverty and crime, decay and illness. We see businesses in disarray, buildings collapsing, men who have hung themselves in their apartments, fights in the street, The only businesses that are doing well are the pawnbroker, the undertaker, and the tavern keeper. All other institutions, both social and economic institutions, are falling into ruin. At the center of this print, quite dramatically, a mother is in a drunken stupor on these steps, oblivious to her child falling down the stairs. Again, sort of maternal neglect is the ultimate tragedy here. Hogarth is anticipating the effects of gin drinking on the next generation, generational neglect here. There's also a skeletal man down at right. Perhaps he has even died already of gin. To that mother's left, you have men battling a dog to chew on a bone. So sort of poverty, desperation, death, neglect. These are all really terrible things here. So this is where Hogarth's commitment to observation meets his commitments to politics, to policy. In contrast, Beer Street is presented as a harmless, beer is presented as a harmless national beverage. Hogarth shows a flourishing urban scene with well-fed citizens. Butchers and fishwives hold tankards of beer. A butcher lifts a skinny Frenchman into the air with one hand. Builders are working on roofs. Houses are clad with scaffolding. So the city prospers, and all the while everyone's drinking beer. Poverty appears only in the ragged coat of the artist painting a tavern sign. So Hogarth's concern for the poor is contradictory, is kind of complicated. A note in the advertisements for these prints ran, quite, as the subjects of the prints are calculated to reform some reigning vices, peculiar to the lower classes of people, in hopes to render them of more extensive use, the author has published them in the cheapest manner possible. So he's selling Gin Lane and Beer Street at 1 shilling, a day's wage for the average person. And the moralizing tone seems to have the poor's interests in mind, but betrays a pretty conservative social position, right, about sort of behavior. And it was very common for 18th century thinkers to adhere to believe really in the hierarchy, the proper hierarchy of social position. So each class should do their duty and not try to rise above. That's Hogarth's whole jokes about wigs. Nobody should pretend or want to be something they're not. And any attempt to leave one's place in society subverts the public order, which ultimately is a pretty conservative position. So his politics, his morals are quite complicated. Hogarth is interested in types, typological figures. The harlot, the rake, these sort of generic-looking figures that stand in for a broader type. The harlot, or the young woman entering London for the first time in this image, right, her likeness is pretty unspecific. She doesn't look like a particular person you would see on the street, but instead is just meant to represent sort of all young, gullible country cousins coming into the city. But some of Hogarth's characters had real-world prototypes. In the Harlot series, contemporaries of Hogarth identified this madam, this bawd, as a woman called Mother Needham, an infamous brothel keeper who was actually punished and pilloried in 1731. A man named Colonel Charteris, a notorious lecher and rapist, is thought to be one of the two men gazing over on the right-hand side of this print. A man who went unpunished because of his powerful class and political connections. So these were two real people that many thought Hogarth was referencing. And you can tell that the faces of the man in the doorway and this brothel madam are more specific than the young woman, right? But these are two real people that were symptomatic of the broader vices of the age. And people also assume that Hogarth does include the occasional portrait because he was also a portraitist. Here's Hogarth's portrait of Captain Thomas Coram from 1740. This is not an aristocrat. This is a middle class person who rose in the ranks through the military. He's a captain. He was philanthropic. He supported foundling children or orphans, and he went from military success to commercial success, and is shown with the trappings of achievement. So we see him holding naval instruments. He's actually not wearing a wig, so Hogarth has no cause to poke fun at him. This was one style, the kind of natural man, that also shows his middle class status, who's not trying to pretend to be anything else. And we have really specific physiological features, right? This is an individual person. This is not a type. The portrait is set amongst classicizing architecture, right? Those columns behind him. And he's set on an elevated platform. So this really is meant to honor, to elevate the sitter here. There's a rhetoric of honesty and directness between sitter and portraitist. Hogarth shows him with a kind of humanizing facial features and attitude here. And the accessories that kind of crowd this portrait are attributes who define, right, who this man is, what he does. This isn't the kind of double layer of identity that Anthony Van Dyck gave the Countess of Southampton as fortune, but instead, right, offers information about the lived identity, profession, interests of the man. So this isn't an allegorical look at this person, but gives a lot of information. So Hogarth shows a commitment to observation, to liveliness. He has a real skill in capturing the movement of his sitters. They seem, vital, alive, part of the world. And his skill, this proliferation of detail that entertained us in his comic history paintings, serves to give the viewer a picture of who the sitter is. And the last painting we'll see is a strange one by Hogarth. This is Shrimp Girl of 1740, somewhere between 1740 and 1745. It wasn't a commissioned portrait. There's not a client, so not paperwork that helps us date it. An unkind view of this image, a shrimp seller. She has a tray of shrimp on top of her head, you can see. So this is a person working, sort of itinerant job. So an unkind view of this image is that Hogarth was enamored with poor people because he could make them sit, he could manipulate them, and he, thought he had this sort of moral high ground that he knew what people should do, right? But this isn't strictly the kind of poverty porn that you can see from some artists. There's a sense of spontaneity here, especially in the expression in this woman's face. This demonstrates Hogarth's ability to capture fleeting facial expressions and a real liveliness in his subjects. This was late in Hogarth's career. This was an experimental canvas. Again, we can't date it because he didn't exhibit it or sell it. And the brushwork, as you can see, is quite loose. That doesn't look so strange to you all, perhaps, because Impressionism happened in the 19th century in the meantime. But this style of loose brushwork would not have been appropriate to exhibit in the 1840s. And I show you this to end because a painting like this, we're left pretty uncertain about whether this is a typological portrait, right? Whether this is a kind of stock type or an individual's likeness. Like the figures in Hogarth's comic history paintings, she's convincing as a real character, yet she has this kind of universal quality. And part of the slippage or confusion between these two categories is that Hogarth creates an undercurrent of real emotion and feeling beneath and through this comedy of manners and his moralizing messages. Through all his series, he has this undercurrent of emotion. So he cares about morality, right? He cares about the end of empire, the decadent behavior that's leading to society's ruin. But his judgments aren't cold. They remain really lively and deeply felt. And that's part of his lasting impact.